Let's talk about JD Vance. He used his speech at the Munich Security Conference accusing European governments of retreating from their values and ignoring voters' concerns when it comes to migration and free speech. Let's take a listen.
And of all the pressing challenges that the nations represented here face, I believe there is nothing more urgent than mass migration. The number of immigrants who entered the EU from non-EU countries doubled between 2021 and 2022 alone, and of course it's gotten much higher since. And we know the situation, it didn't materialize in a vacuum. It's the result of a series of conscious decisions made by politicians all over the continent and others across the world over the span of a decade.
The mainstream media went into meltdown over this. Here's the BBC's headline: JD Vance attacks Europe over free speech and migration. But Emily, it's argued that his comments are absolutely justified. Mass migration is a huge problem facing Europe. And as for free speech, that has to be defended.
It's amazing. I mean, even some people on the American left looked at JD Vance's speech and said, I'm thinking of Glenn Greenwald. Like, it is remarkable to hear an American leader speaking this way. And I would add to that, it's remarkable to see someone on the right who is as high profile in American politics as JD Vance is speaking this way at a conference like this from a podium like that one. These are things that have been unspoken for a long time. And JD Vance very eloquently made an argument about in front of people who never hear this type of criticism. They relegate this type of criticism to the fringes of disinformation and conspiracy theorizing. And that's even how his speech was covered, which is the most predictable thing in the world. Some of these obvious facts that he's sharing got written off and smeared by the mainstream media as conspiracy mongering or fringe thought. And so they just basically proved his point. And what they're also proving is how hard it's going to be for the Trump administration to make this argument, for it to fall and with any welcomeness among other world leaders. But I mean, these are hard truths that go unspoken very often.
Absolutely. And thank goodness we do have platforms such as X where we can see the speech in full. People aren't no longer really listening to or relying on the mainstream media for their take on what's been happening. Let's talk about the talks between the US and Russia about the war in Ukraine that are reportedly set to begin tomorrow. The Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, Middle East Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, and National Security Advisor Mike Waltz are travelling to Saudi Arabia for the talks. Now, Saudi Arabia is expected to be involved, playing a mediation role, and it comes after the UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer said that he was willing to put British troops on the ground in Ukraine to enforce a peace deal if that's necessary. And this is what Donald Trump has had to say on the war.
No, I think he wants to stop. That was my question to him, because if he's going to go on, that would have been a big problem for us, and that would have caused me a big problem, because you just can't let that happen. I think he wants to end it, and they want to end it fast, both of them, and Zelensky wants to end it too.
Emily, it's going to be really interesting. What are you expecting from these talks? I suppose, how quickly could we even see some sort of agreement being made?
Yeah, I mean, Donald Trump, of course, said he could do this very, very quickly before he was elected president, and we'll test that. He does. The way that he's talking right there, I think, is clearly trying to show his leverage. And the question is whether, we've already seen some people in the ultra pro-Ukrainian position who believe that Ukraine should not have to give up an inch of its territory, accuse the Trump administration of pushing Ukraine out of these talks. Marco Rubio actually responded to that and said, well, we're obviously talking to them. We've been talking to them. So I think that's going to be a theme coming out of this, is whether it looks like Ukraine had appropriate input and had an appropriate, seat at the table. If it was, that seems to be Zelensky's sensitivity point. And Marco Rubio is going to have to make that case. Donald Trump's going to have to make that case, frankly. But I'm sure that they have very specific plans, because Keith Kellogg, his NSA, or his former NSA, Trump's former NSA, who's now his special envoy here, has talked about this in detail for months before Donald Trump was even elected. So they have a lot to talk about, that is for sure.
Absolutely. We'll be watching it very closely. I want to talk to you about the Democrats. Early polling shows who the front runners might be 3 years out from the 2028 Democratic presidential primary. Newsweek reports that the prominent Democrats taking an early lead include, wait for it, Kamala Harris, Gavin Newsom, AOC, and even Tim Walz's name is emerging. My goodness, they really are in a weak position. Look, do you have any faith, just listening to who's listed as some of the key players who are the top options for the Democrats? Are any of those going to work, or do they need someone else to come through?
This is absolutely crazy. This is a disaster for Democrats. They've got nothing right now if these are their best options. I think probably Gavin Newsom is the strongest of those just because he understands how to adapt to this very, very rapidly changing political climate. But of that list, I mean, can any one of them pass the Joe Rogan test? And by that, I mean, could any one of them sit for a conversation with Joe Rogan and come across as relatable and appealing? Kamala Harris obviously didn't even try, but had she tried, I'm not so sure. It may have helped her a little bit, but it actually may have backfired because you have to be somebody. JD Vance did this very well. Obviously Trump did it well in terms of authenticity and being an entertainer, but JD Vance sat and talked to Joe Rogan authentically, guy to guy for a long time. Could any of those people on that list pass that test? Are any of them actually able to reach out to your average working class, white or black or Hispanic male voter to the point where Democrats are able to put up better numbers in a presidential election? No, is a very clear answer to that question at this point. So that's a really, really sharp problem for them.
Absolutely not. That is the short answer. No, but it's great to see the Joe Rogan test, that's kind of the new standard, that politicians can't get away with just one or two catchphrases or some spin. They really have to be authentic and be able to speak for 3 hours, answering all types of questions and not getting tripped up. I think it's a good thing, and I think it means that, Americans can get a stronger sense of who someone really is. Kamala Harris, she attended a Broadway show in New York City and she reminded everyone about her speaking skills. Let's take a listen.
For those rights to be maintained, which means we have to be vigilant, and it's just the nature of it. Yes, I mean, look at this beautiful play and everything that we know he was suppressed, he had to suppress so much. But he knew, and he took those risks, but we have to be clear-eyed. And it doesn't mean we don't see the beauty in everything, right? These things all coexist. But I believe we fight for something, not against something.
Another word salad, that's what she's known for, and that's not changing. I really doubt that there are that many people who are watching a clip like that and going, oh, she's presidential, or, wish she was in charge.
I mean, what a perfect segue from the last conversation we were having about Joe Rogan, in that Kamala Harris could have sat for 3 hours all she wanted, but she still sounds like this. And that's the big problem with Democratic politicians right now, is that Donald Trump forced Republicans to put up candidates that just relate better to the American people because maybe they're more casual, maybe they're more adapted to digital media, but Democrats haven't had anything forcing them to do that. They had Joe Biden, a man who couldn't take questions for most of his presidency at length because he would stare off into the distance and look like he was lacking mental capacity. So they haven't been forced, right? Yes, that was very clear to everyone. And they haven't been forced to put up someone who really can be authentic. And this is Kamala Harris in what should be the most authentic situation in the world. She's just talking to some people. It's not even a speech. She's just talking. And she can't do that without sounding like a robot. And that's true of most high-profile Democrats because they haven't had something like Donald Trump force them to choose better people at this point.
Finally, Vivek Ramaswamy appears to have kicked off his campaign to become Ohio's next governor. He's filed paperwork with the Ohio Secretary of State's office, signalling his run for the 2026 election. Now, he's expected to launch his campaign next week. What can we expect from this, Emily?
This is actually going to be a really tough race. He comes in with a lot of name recognition and probably a lot of money. He has baked into his candidacy that he's been close to Donald Trump. That said, these races do tend to be more local. And what that means is the Republican Party in Ohio and Republican voters in Ohio are going to look at this race really closely. It's not going to all be about name recognition, and it's not going to all be about money. So if you're someone who came up through the ranks in Ohio politics over the course course of years, you actually will, as Ramaswamy's likely opponents have, you're actually going to have to deal with that if you're Ramaswamy. So I think a lot of people saw this as maybe a consolation prize, a slam dunk, like, oh, he's going to run back to Ohio and he'll climb the ladder there and it'll be a sort of easy rung on the ladder for him. But actually, these things are really tough. JD Vance's primary was really tough in the Senate race back when he was first elected by Republicans. So this is not going to be a slam dunk by any stretch of the imagination, though he will certainly be competitive.
Washington DC correspondent at UnHerd, Emily Jashinsky, thank you so much for joining us in Power Hour.
Thanks for having me.